It started like any other quiet morning in the small town. The streets were calm, the sunlight just beginning to warm the sidewalks, and people were moving at their usual slow pace. From the outside, everything seemed ordinary. On this street, most of the houses were neatly painted, the gardens trimmed, and the sidewalks free of clutter. But the main character, who had lived here long enough to notice every little detail, knew that the calm was only on the surface. Beneath it, there was a pattern that bothered them more and more each day, for months. They had been observing how the rules in the neighborhood were being ignored. It was not a huge conspiracy or anything dramatic, just small things that built up over time. People parked their cars on the sidewalks, blocked the fire hydrants with garbage bins, and left dangerous debris on the streets after construction. Some even built small extensions to their homes without permits. Nothing big enough to attract the attention of the authorities immediately, but enough to create risk and discomfort for others. And every time someone tried to point it out politely, it was brushed off with a laugh or a shrug. The main character saw it all, quietly making notes in their mind, knowing that eventually something had to change. Every morning, as they walked through the street to get their coffee, they noticed the same things happening repeatedly. A car parked dangerously close to the corner, making it hard for people to see when crossing the street. A pile of construction debris left for days outside a house that had started some renovation without checking local rules. Children playing near broken fences that should have been repaired long ago. It wasn't just careless. It was disrespectful to the rules and unsafe for everyone. Yet, when neighbors discussed it, most said, "It's not a big deal," or "Everyone does it, so why bother?" The main character felt a tightness in their chest every time they heard that, because they knew these little things could turn into big problems. If no one acted, it wasn't that the main character enjoyed conflict. They didn't, but they had a sense of responsibility that others seemed to lack. Every time they saw a warning sign ignored, it felt like a small personal failure, as if they should have done something earlier to stop it. They often thought about talking to the people directly, warning them about the potential dangers or fines. But so far, they had held back. They wanted to understand the full picture first, to see whether the pattern was consistent, and if the problem was bigger than just a few careless neighbors. One day, they noticed something that shook them a little. Across the street, a house that had been under minor renovations suddenly had workers lifting heavy metal beams without any safety gear. The beams were awkwardly balanced on the ground, some even leaning toward the street. Children from nearby houses were playing just a few feet away, laughing and chasing each other. It was a scene that could have easily turned into a serious accident. The main character felt a rush of anxiety. They knew that if someone got hurt, no one would take responsibility. And yet, most people around seemed completely unaware or unconcerned. They took a step closer, pretending to tie their shoes just to get a better look. One of the workers saw them watching and waved. The main character waved back politely, but inside, they were thinking about how easily things could go wrong. After a few minutes, the worker called over his supervisor, who just shrugged and said it was fine. That shrugged, so casual and dismissive, was the moment the main character realized something important. If they didn't act, no one else would. And acting, they knew, meant more than just a warning. It meant showing people that rules were not optional, that ignoring them could have serious consequences. Every day after that, they observed more carefully. They started noticing patterns they had missed before. The same house would leave garbage bins blocking the sidewalk every Thursday. A neighbor's dog ran loose every morning, scaring the mail carriers and small children. A car parked across the crosswalk every afternoon, forcing pedestrians to step into the street to get around it. Each violation was small on its own, but together, they created a landscape of disorder and danger. They even noticed that some people seemed to take pleasure in bending the rules, as if the more they ignored regulations, the more they felt clever. Sometimes, the main character would try to talk to them casually, giving friendly reminders or suggestions. "Hey, that pile of bricks might be dangerous for the kids," or "You might want to move the bins so the sidewalk is clear." Most of the time, the responses were polite on the surface but dismissive at heart. "Oh, thanks, but we've always done it this way." Or, "It's only for a day or two, no harm done." Those responses were like little sparks of frustration. They reminded the main character that this wasn't just about safety, it was about respect, responsibility, and the idea that some people thought rules were optional. It wasn't easy to stay calm. The main character could feel their patience wearing thin. There were evenings when they sat at home, reviewing the day in their mind, replaying every incident, thinking about how things could have gone wrong. They imagined a child tripping over construction debris, a car accident at the corner blocked by illegal parking, a dog running into traffic. The mental scenarios were endless and frightening. They had to keep reminding themselves to stay composed, to observe, to gather evidence rather than act rashly. Acting too soon without proof could backfire. At work, the main character's mind was often elsewhere. Every phone call, every meeting, every lunch break included a mental check of the neighborhood. They started keeping a small notebook, jotting down times, places, and incidents. Every observation mattered. Even small details could be important later. The notebook became a kind of journal, a record of negligence, but also a shield for themselves. If anyone asked why they were so concerned about minor violations, they could point to facts, not feelings. They didn't want to be another complainer. They wanted to be someone who made a real difference. One afternoon, a serious situation almost happened. A delivery truck tried to turn the corner where cars were parked illegally, and the driver struggled to maneuver. The horn blared, pedestrians jumped back, and the situation could have ended in damage to the truck or injuries to passersby. The main character rushed over and guided the driver. But the neighbors responsible for the parked cars just watched with faint amusement, as if the chaos was entertaining. That moment crystallized everything for the main character. They realized that the rules weren't just suggestions, they were protections. And without someone to enforce them, protection meant nothing. That night, as the street grew quiet and the lights in the houses flickered on one by one, the main character made a decision. They would not ignore it any longer. They would continue to observe, but this time they would prepare. They would gather evidence, record patterns, and wait for the right moment to act. The idea wasn't to punish for the sake of punishment. It was to remind people that actions have consequences, that safety and fairness mattered. They wanted to show that ignoring rules was not harmless. It could cost someone injury, stress, or worse. In the following days, the main character became more vigilant. They walked the streets at different times, sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the evening, noting every detail. They paid attention to which neighbors ignored warnings, who argued when reminded, and who actually tried to comply when given a gentle nudge. They realized there were levels to this problem. Some people were careless but well-meaning. Others were reckless and dismissive. And some took pride in bending rules. Understanding these differences would be crucial for what was coming next. People started noticing the main character around more often. Some smiled politely, others gave curious glances, but nobody knew the real reason behind the watchful eyes. The main character never revealed their role or authority yet. That would come later, when the right moment arrived. For now, it was enough to observe, take notes, and prepare. They felt a mixture of tension and anticipation, knowing that change was coming, but also knowing that it would not be easy. It was in these quiet, ordinary mornings and evenings that the story began. A pattern of rule-breaking, small but consistent, was being carefully documented. The main character's sense of responsibility, patience, and determination were growing stronger every day. They understood that the moment to act was not just about catching people in the act. It was about creating awareness, respect, and accountability. And although the neighborhood looked calm and ordinary from the outside behind the scenes, the stage was being set for a confrontation that would change everything, even as they prepared quietly. The main character reminded themselves to stay fair and objective. This was not about revenge or superiority. It was about ensuring that safety and order were respected. They knew that when the time came to reveal their authority, some people would be angry, some surprised, and some ashamed. But it was a necessary step. Because without someone to step in, the pattern of negligence and disregard for the rules would only get worse. And that was something the main character could not allow. For now, the street remained the same on the surface. Children played, cars drove by, and neighbors went about their routines. But behind the calm, the main character was preparing for what everyone else was ignoring. They watched, they noted, and they waited. The story of the rule breakers and the one person who would hold them accountable was just beginning. And the neighborhood, unaware of the storm quietly gathering, had no idea that the quiet observer on the street would soon become the force that reminded them that rules, no matter how small, mattered more than they had ever realized. Days passed after the main character had decided to watch carefully and prepare. They noticed more clearly how people had become completely comfortable ignoring the rules. It wasn't just the big violations that concerned them anymore. It was the little things that added up to a bigger problem. A neighbor who left trash scattered on the street after the garbage truck had come. Another who parked in front of the fire hydrant while running inside for 10 minutes. And yet another who let children climb on a weak fence that was supposed to be repaired weeks ago. Every morning brought a new example of carelessness. And every day the same neighbors treated it as if nothing mattered. The main character tried a few more casual interventions, thinking perhaps a friendly conversation might help. They knocked on doors to talk politely, gave advice gently, and even suggested small fixes that would make life safer for everyone. The sidewalk is blocked. Maybe move the bins so people can walk safely, they said to one neighbor. Another neighbor was told, those construction materials are dangerous for kids. Maybe stack them safely or keep them away from the street. Most of the time they were met with polite smiles that hid disinterest or mild annoyance. Sometimes, someone would even laugh and say, "You worry too much. It's fine." That response was always the hardest to take because it made the main character feel invisible, as if their concerns had no weight. Despite the dismissals, the main character continued to observe. They started noticing small habits that showed how much people had become used to ignoring rules. For example, every Thursday, a pile of garbage would sit on the sidewalk for hours before being collected. Every morning, one neighbor's dog ran loose, barking at passersby and chasing mail carriers. Every evening, cars would park in places that made it almost impossible for other drivers to see the street corner. The main character realized that these repeated actions were not accidents. They were choices. People were ignoring rules because they felt they could get away with it. Nobody was stopping them. One afternoon, a more serious situation unfolded. A delivery truck was trying to turn the corner near the illegally parked cars. The driver struggled to maneuver, honking the horn in frustration. Pedestrians jumped back to avoid being hit, and children playing nearby froze in fear. The main character rushed over to guide the driver, waving to the kids to move back. They could see the truck driver's relief when the situation passed safely. But they also noticed the smug looks of some neighbors. To them, it was almost entertaining. They seemed to think the main character was overreacting. That moment made it clear that talking politely was not enough. People had stopped listening to warnings. They had stopped caring. It was not only the safety issues that worried the main character. They could see how the repeated violations affected the community's harmony. Arguments started quietly among neighbors. People complained behind closed doors about noise, mess, and blocked pathways. Tension built in ways that could not be ignored. Small annoyances turned into resentment. One evening, two neighbors had a heated argument over the placement of trash bins, and it escalated quickly. The main character watched from a distance, feeling a mix of frustration and concern. They knew that if someone stepped in too late, the argument could turn violent, so the main character started planning. They knew they needed more than polite reminders. They needed proof, records, and patterns that could no longer be ignored. They began taking photographs, noting times and dates, and writing down details of each violation. Every act of carelessness was logged. They observed not just the obvious issues, but also subtle patterns: who ignored warnings, encouraged others to bend rules, and who simply watched without saying anything. They realized that the problem was deeper than just a few careless individuals. It was a mindset, a culture of ignoring responsibility, even as they documented everything. The main character tried to understand why people behaved this way. They noticed that some neighbors simply did not realize the consequences of their actions. They were careless, not malicious. Others, however, seemed to take pride in bending the rules, as if breaking them made them cleverer than the rest. This realization made the main character even more determined. They understood that when the time came to act, they would need to treat each person differently. Some might need a firm explanation, others just a reminder, and a few would need a full understanding of the consequences before they could be convinced to change. The main character also started talking to some of the neighbors who were more responsible. They found that these people were frustrated too. They had tried to raise concerns, but their voices were drowned out by the louder, more dismissive neighbors. Some had even stopped trying altogether, feeling that nothing would change. The main character listened carefully, took their accounts, and promised to consider them when the time came to take action. These conversations gave the main character a clearer sense of the community's dynamics and the resistance they would face. They also reinforced the idea that their eventual intervention would not be about punishing individuals, but restoring fairness and safety for everyone as the days went on. Small incidents became more frequent. One neighbor installed a small extension to their house without a permit. Another started cutting down trees near the sidewalk, leaving branches scattered on the street. The dog that ran loose in the mornings started chasing cyclists, almost causing accidents. Every day the main character felt the tension in the air, like a storm waiting to break. And yet, they remained calm on the surface, knowing that patience and planning were crucial. Acting too soon could backfire. Acting too late could mean someone got hurt. Then came the day that tested everything. A construction worker carrying heavy tools stumbled near the street, almost dropping a beam that could have hit a child. The main character rushed over, helping secure the beam and guiding the children to safety. But instead of concern, the worker and the supervisor waved it off as if it were nothing. That casual disregard shocked the main character. It was clear now that the situation was no longer safe to ignore. Polite reminders were ineffective. Dismissals and laughter were now dangerous. It was time to move beyond observation. That evening, the main character sat at their desk, reviewing the notes and photos they had collected. The violations were not random. They formed a pattern that could no longer be dismissed. They could see the times, locations, and repeated behaviors. It was like a map of carelessness, showing not only the problems, but also the people responsible. The main character knew that when they eventually acted, they would have the evidence to show everyone that ignoring rules was not harmless. They could demonstrate the real risk and the pattern of negligence. They also thought about how to approach the situation. Confrontation would be necessary, but it had to be fair and factual. They would need to explain clearly why each violation mattered and what the consequences could be if things continued. They wanted the neighbors to understand that rules were not arbitrary. They were there for a reason: to protect everyone, to maintain order, and to prevent accidents that could have serious consequences. The main character knew this would not be easy. Some people would resist, argue, or even ridicule them. But they also knew that staying quiet any longer would be worse. Over the next few days, the main character continued to observe, now with a sharper focus. They noticed that some neighbors started arguing among themselves more frequently, as frustrations grew over repeated violations. They saw the subtle tension in the air, the way people avoided certain streets or corners because they were blocked or unsafe. They noticed how children began playing more cautiously, learning from adults' disregard for rules. It was clear that the impact of negligence extended far beyond what anyone realized. They also saw small signs of hope. A few neighbors, when gently reminded, made small efforts to comply. One moved a pile of bricks to a safer place. Another restrained their dog in the mornings. These small changes were encouraging, but the main character knew they were temporary. Without consistent enforcement, people would quickly revert to careless habits. That was why they needed a plan, a strategy that would ensure lasting change as the sun set each day. Casting long shadows across the street, the main character felt both fatigue and determination. Observing so many repeated violations was exhausting, but it was also sharpening their resolve. They could see the pattern clearly now, and they were ready to act when the time came. They knew that the moment to intervene had to be strategic. With evidence in hand and a clear plan for addressing each type of violation, the main character began imagining how the intervention would unfold. They pictured walking down the street, calmly but firmly explaining the situation to each neighbor. They imagined showing the photos, pointing out the repeated issues, and making it clear that the rules were not optional. They imagined the shock on some faces, the disbelief, and eventually the understanding. They also imagined the relief that would follow once the neighborhood returned to safety and order. This vision gave them energy, even as they faced the challenges of preparing for what would be a difficult confrontation. By the end of the week, the pattern of negligence had become undeniable. The piles of trash, the blocked sidewalks, the reckless parking, and the unsafe construction all painted a clear picture. The main character felt a sense of urgency. They could no longer wait or hope that neighbors would change on their own. The evidence was clear, the risk was clear, and the responsibility was theirs. It was time to step forward, but carefully, thoughtfully, decisively. The main character's mind was a mix of anxiety and determination. They were aware that confrontation could lead to anger or resentment. Some neighbors would not take kindly to being corrected, especially if they thought they had been getting away with breaking rules for months. But they also knew that safety and fairness mattered more than temporary discomfort. They reminded themselves that the goal was not punishment, but restoration of order and respect for the rules that everyone had agreed to follow. In the following days, the main character made the final preparations. They organized their notes, categorized the violations, and prepared a list of consequences that could occur if the patterns continued. They were ready to show the neighbors the reality of their actions, to make it impossible for anyone to dismiss or ignore the problems any longer. And as they walked through the streets one evening, notebook in hand, they felt a quiet confidence. The time to act was approaching, and the main character was ready to ensure that the rules would finally be taken seriously. The days that followed were tense in a way. The main character could feel deep in their chest. The violations had not stopped, and the carelessness of the neighbors seemed to be growing bolder. Cars were now regularly parked in places that blocked not just sidewalks, but parts of the street. Construction materials were left in precarious positions, some teetering dangerously near where children played. Even the dog that ran loose seemed to sense the chaos and became more aggressive, chasing bicycles and barking at everyone who came close. The main character walked through the streets each morning and evening, notebook in hand, noting every single detail. It was exhausting work, but necessary. Every observation was part of a larger picture. The picture was alarming. One afternoon, the main character noticed a situation that made their stomach twist. Across the street, one of the neighbors was working on a small structure, lifting heavy beams without any support. A child had wandered too close, chasing a ball that had rolled onto the street. The worker did not notice, and the child laughed, oblivious to the danger above. The main character rushed forward, shouting to grab both the child's and the worker's attention. The worker barely turned his head, muttering under his breath and continuing to lift the beam. The main character's heart pounded as they pulled the child back to safety. For a moment, they considered shouting at the worker more aggressively. But they knew that words alone would not change this behavior. They needed action, evidence, and a way to make sure these repeated dangers could no longer be ignored. That evening, as they sat at home reviewing their notes, the main character felt both frustration and determination. They could not ignore it any longer. The pattern of negligence was clear. Every day there was a new risk, a new violation, a new moment that could have ended in injury or worse. They thought about how people laughed off warnings, ignored suggestions, and acted as if rules were made to be broken. It was not just a question of disrespect, it was now a matter of safety and responsibility. The main character realized that a breaking point was approaching, a moment when something would inevitably go wrong if no one intervened. The next morning brought that moment closer than ever. A delivery van tried to make its way down the street, but cars were parked on both sides, leaving barely enough room for it to pass. The driver honked, signaling frustration, while pedestrians tried to step out of the way. The main character ran to the scene, waving to calm both the driver and the people on the street. A child stumbled into the road, and the main character caught them just in time. The neighbors responsible for the blocked parking stood nearby, smiling as if it was funny, ignoring the chaos around them. The main character's patience began to wear thin. It was clear now that warnings and gentle suggestions had failed. This situation demanded more than polite reminders. It demanded accountability. As the day went on, the main character walked through the streets, documenting everything with renewed focus. They took photos of the blocked sidewalks, the unsafe construction sites, the scattered debris, and the reckless parking. Every image and every note added to a growing record that could no longer be dismissed. They also started observing the behaviors of the neighbors more closely, taking mental notes of who ignored warnings, who encouraged others to break rules, and who simply stood by silently. It became evident that some people were actively resisting any form of order, while others were merely indifferent. Understanding these differences would be crucial when it came time to act. In the afternoon, another incident occurred that tested the main character's resolve. A group of children had wandered near a construction site where a beam had been left precariously. One of the beams slipped slightly, making a loud noise that startled the children and caused one to fall. The main character rushed over immediately, helping the child to their feet and checking for injuries. The worker responsible shrugged as if nothing had happened, muttering that accidents were part of life. The main character felt a wave of anger but remained calm. They knew that reacting in anger would only escalate the situation. Instead, they focused on documenting what had happened, taking photos and making detailed notes. This record would be essential when the time came to confront the rule breakers. That evening, as they sat at their desk, the main character reviewed the day's events. The incidents were not isolated. They were part of a consistent pattern of negligence. The blocked streets, unsafe construction, and careless behaviors were all connected. They could see clearly now that polite warnings were ineffective. People had grown too comfortable ignoring rules, too accustomed to bending them for convenience. The main character realized that the next step had to be decisive. They needed to show the neighbors that their actions had real consequences and that ignoring rules was not harmless. The main character also thought about the emotional aspect of the situation. They knew that confrontation could lead to anger, denial, or even resentment. Some neighbors would not take kindly to being corrected, especially if they had been getting away with violations for months. But the main character reminded themselves that the goal was not to punish, but to restore order and safety. They wanted to ensure that everyone understood why the rules existed and why following them mattered. They wanted to prevent accidents, protect children, and create a community where people respected one another. The next day, a near disaster occurred that further reinforced the urgency of action. A heavy branch from a poorly maintained tree fell onto the sidewalk just as a group of children was passing by. The main character arrived in time to pull one child out of the way, but another child tripped over the scattered debris. Luckily, no one was seriously injured, but the situation could have been far worse. The neighbors responsible for the tree maintenance were indifferent, muttering excuses and showing little concern. The main character realized that waiting any longer was dangerous. This was the breaking point, the moment when action could no longer be postponed. Over the next few days, the main character continued to observe and document everything meticulously. They walked the streets at different times, noting not just violations, but also the attitudes of the neighbors. They saw how some ignored warnings entirely, how others encouraged bending rules, and how a few tried to comply but were frustrated by the lack of support. They started creating a detailed plan for confrontation, thinking carefully about the order in which they would approach each neighbor, the evidence they would present, and the explanations they would give. Every detail mattered. They knew that the success of the intervention depended on preparation, clarity, and fairness. The main character also began speaking to neighbors who were responsible and respectful. They listened to their frustrations, documented their experiences, and reassured them that change was coming. These conversations provided valuable insight into how the community had been affected by the repeated negligence. It also reinforced the main character's understanding that the goal was not to punish individuals, but to restore balance and safety. The support of responsible neighbors would be important when the intervention began, as providing credibility and reinforcement. One morning, another dangerous situation arose. A construction worker had left tools scattered near the sidewalk, and a child stepped on one, twisting their ankle. The main character arrived immediately, helping the child and documenting the scene. The worker shrugged, muttering that the child should have been more careful. The main character realized that some people had become completely desensitized to danger. They no longer saw the risk, only inconvenience or minor annoyance. It was clear that education alone would not suffice. Firm action was required to make them understand that their behavior had consequences as the days went on. Tension in the neighborhood grew. Arguments between neighbors became more frequent. People complained quietly about noise, blocked pathways, and unsafe behaviors. Small incidents began to escalate, creating a climate of frustration and anxiety. The main character observed these tensions carefully, noting who was affected most and who contributed to the chaos. They realized that a well-timed intervention could not only address rule-breaking, but also reduce conflict, creating a safer and more harmonious environment. By the end of the week, the main character had gathered a comprehensive record of violations. Photos, notes, and observations painted a clear picture: repeated negligence, unsafe practices, and a culture of ignoring rules. They also had a clear understanding of the neighbors' attitudes, their likely reactions, and the support of responsible residents. It was now time to move from observation to action. The main character felt a mix of anxiety and determination. They knew that confrontation would not be easy, but it was necessary. On the morning of the planned intervention, the main character walked through the streets one last time, reviewing their notes mentally. Every violation, every pattern, every observation was fresh in their mind. They reminded themselves to remain calm, clear, and fair. The goal was not to shame anyone, but to ensure that rules were respected and safety restored. They knew that some neighbors would be surprised, some angry, and some resistant. But the evidence was undeniable. The main character felt ready to face whatever reactions came their way. By mid-morning, the first confrontation began. The main character approached a neighbor responsible for blocking sidewalks with trash bins. Calmly and politely, they presented the photos and notes, explaining the repeated incidents and the risks involved. The neighbor initially laughed, dismissing the concerns. But the main character remained firm, showing the clear pattern and explaining the potential consequences. Gradually, the neighbor's amusement faded as the seriousness of the situation became apparent. The main character repeated this process with others, maintaining patience, clarity, and fairness. Each neighbor saw the evidence and realized that their actions had been noticed and documented by the afternoon. Word began to spread that someone was taking the violations seriously. Some neighbors became defensive, arguing or denying responsibility. Others were quiet, processing the evidence. The main character remained composed, responding to each reaction calmly and consistently. The goal was not confrontation for its own sake, but ensuring understanding and compliance. Slowly, the pattern of carelessness began to break down. Neighbors who had previously ignored warnings started to make small changes. Piles of trash were moved, construction materials were secured, and dangerous behaviors were curtailed. The main character felt a mixture of relief and vigilance. The intervention had begun, but it was only the first step. They knew that some people would need continued oversight and reminders. Others would need reinforcement to maintain the changes. But for the first time, there was hope that the rules would be respected and that the neighborhood could become safer. The main character also felt a quiet satisfaction. Their patience, observation, and careful planning had paid off. They had waited for the right moment, gathered evidence, and acted decisively. The impact was already visible, and it would grow over time. The morning began quietly, but the main character could feel the tension in the air. After the first round of confrontations, some neighbors were uneasy, some curious, and others openly annoyed. The calm streets of the past weeks were gone, replaced by whispers, glances, and an underlying awareness that someone had been paying attention. The main character walked slowly, notebook in hand, aware that today would be the day for the full reveal. They had gathered all the evidence, spoken to responsible neighbors, and prepared a plan that would make it impossible for anyone to dismiss the seriousness of the situation. Their first stop was the house where construction materials had been left dangerously near the street. The neighbor, who had laughed off previous warnings, was outside, checking on the progress of a small extension. The main character approached calmly, smiling politely, but with a firmness in their voice. "Good morning," they said. "I need to show you something." Without waiting for a response, They handed over the photographs, notes, and evidence that documented the repeated violations. The neighbor looked through them quickly, raising an eyebrow. "What is this?" they asked, trying to maintain a casual tone. But the corners of their mouth twitched nervously. "This," the main character said, "is a record of every time the rules here have been ignored. Every blocked sidewalk, every unsafe placement of materials, every behavior that could have caused harm." Their voice was steady, calm, but carried the weight of authority. The neighbor's casual smirk began to fade. They looked from the photos to the main character, trying to gauge whether this was just another complaint. But the calm confidence in the main character's posture, the detailed notes, and the evidence made it clear this was something different. I don't understand," the neighbor stammered. "Why are you showing me all this?" The main character paused for a moment, then smiled slightly. "Because it matters. Rules exist for a reason, and ignoring them isn't harmless. It puts people at risk." They could see the neighbor swallowing nervously. But more importantly, the main character continued, "I am not just someone pointing out problems. I am the inspector responsible for enforcing these rules. What you see here is not a warning from a neighbor. This is an official notice." The effect was immediate. The neighbor's face went pale, and their smirk disappeared entirely. "Inspector," they said, barely above a whisper. The main character nodded calmly, pulling out their official identification. The badge and paperwork were clear and authoritative. "Yes," they said. "All of this," they gestured to the photos and notes, "is part of your record. The violations cannot continue, and I am here to ensure that they stop." The neighbor's eyes widened, a mix of shock, fear, and realization washing over them. Word spread quickly. As the main character moved through the street, more neighbors began to gather. Curious about the calm figure walking with authority and carrying evidence. When they approached the next house, the owner was watering plants, chatting casually with a neighbor. The main character stopped, smiled politely, and said, "I need to speak with you about some repeated safety violations." The neighbor laughed lightly at first, thinking it was another casual warning, but as the main character displayed the photos, notes, and evidence, the laughter faded. "You've been watching us?" the neighbor asked, a nervous edge to their voice. "Yes," the main character said, "and there is more you should know. I am the inspector. This is not just observation, it is enforcement. The rules you have ignored exist for everyone's safety, and now it is time to correct these issues before any real harm occurs." The neighbor's posture stiffened. They glanced at the photos, the notes, and then back at the main character, who stood calmly, unwavering, and prepared. For the first time, the neighbor realized that ignoring rules was no longer possible. The evidence was undeniable, and the authority behind it was clear. Some neighbors reacted with anger. One shouted, "This is ridiculous. You can't just show up and accuse us like this." The main character listened calmly, nodding slightly. "I understand that it may feel sudden," they said. "But these violations have been ongoing for months. They have been documented. They cannot be ignored. My goal is not to punish, but to make sure everyone is safe and that the rules are followed." The tone was firm but fair. Slowly, the neighbor's anger softened into reluctant acknowledgement. They could see that the main character was not there to argue or escalate unnecessarily. They were there to ensure accountability. By midday, the main character had confronted several households. Presenting the evidence and explaining the consequences of continued violations, people who had previously laughed at warnings now listened in silence, some shifting nervously, others whispering to each other. It was a scene of shock and realization. The casual disregard that had defined the neighborhood for months began to crumble. The main character moved with calm authority, responding to questions and concerns without hesitation. Every explanation was clear, factual, and fair. Every action was rooted in the need for safety and compliance, not personal judgment. Children who had previously played near unsafe construction areas watched from a distance, curious but safe. Some parents came out, relieved that someone was finally taking the risks seriously. They whispered quietly among themselves, expressing gratitude and amazement that the main character had not only observed but taken decisive action. The main character noted their reactions, feeling a quiet satisfaction that the intervention was not only corrective, but also protective. The neighborhood, for the first time in months, felt like a community being looked after. Some neighbors attempted to argue, trying to downplay the violations or shift blame. The main character remained calm, addressing each point methodically. "This is not about blame," they said. "It is about preventing harm and maintaining safety. The rules are here for everyone. Ignoring them affects all of us." Gradually, the arguments subsided. The evidence was clear. The calm authority of the main character left little room for denial. Even the most resistant neighbors could see that their actions had consequences and that the time for excuses had passed. By late afternoon, the main character had completed the full round of confrontations. The neighborhood was buzzing with quiet discussion. People were talking about the inspector, the evidence, and the seriousness of the situation. Those who had once ignored rules now understood that the patterns of negligence were documented and that further violations would not be tolerated. The calm confidence and thorough preparation of the main character had made a clear impression. Safety, order, and responsibility were no longer optional. They were mandatory. The main character paused in the middle of the street, observing the subtle changes. Neighbors were moving more carefully, clearing sidewalks, securing construction materials, and ensuring that children were kept safe. Even those who had been resistant were now quietly complying. It was a moment of quiet victory. The main character knew that change would take time, but the foundation had been laid. The authority had been established, and the rules were no longer invisible. People understood that negligence could not continue unchecked. As evening approached, the main character reflected on the day. The reveal had been more successful than anticipated. The combination of clear evidence, calm authority, and methodical explanation had worked. Neighbors who had dismissed warnings for months were now listening, adjusting, and understanding the importance of rules. The main character felt a mixture of relief and satisfaction, knowing that patience, observation, and preparation had been key. Acting too early or without evidence might have caused resistance. But the careful approach had made the intervention effective and fair. Later that night, the main character walked through the neighborhood once more. The streets were calmer, the hazards addressed, and the small victories evident. Trash bins were moved, construction materials secured, cars parked safely, and children supervised. The atmosphere had shifted subtly but noticeably. There was respect in the air, respect for rules, for safety, and for the person who had patiently ensured that compliance was not optional. The main character felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. They had not only enforced rules but also restored a sense of order and safety to the community in the following days. The changes became more permanent. Neighbors continued to comply with the rules, having seen the evidence and understanding the authority behind the intervention. Some continued to grumble quietly, but even they adjusted their behaviors. Children could play safely again. People could walk on the sidewalks without obstruction. And drivers no longer faced dangerous blockages. The main character's careful planning and calm execution had transformed the neighborhood. The culture of negligence was beginning to shift, replaced by awareness and responsibility. The main character also checked in with the responsible neighbors, who had supported them quietly. They expressed gratitude for the fair and patient approach. "I thought nothing would ever change," one neighbor said. "But seeing how carefully you handled everything, it makes sense now," another added. "We all ignored the rules for too long. Thank you for making us see why they matter." The main character listened, nodding, feeling satisfied but humble. The goal had always been to protect people and restore order, not to seek praise. Still, the acknowledgement from the community reinforced that the intervention had been necessary and effective.